The root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples, and the nations shall inquire of him. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
What does it mean to have roots? What does it mean to be rooted somewhere? To get in touch with one's roots? Social commentators today are saying my generation is especially prone to rootlessness. And if you believe the hype, and if my friends' experiences are normal, this is an issue worth addressing. Rootlessness is, of course, not unique to my generation. We've just spent a lot of time under the microscope lately. Let's take a deeper look at this phenomenon in the form of a certain book. There are certain coffee table books from your childhood that never left the table and have thus burned themselves into your brain, right? I don't really think it took my mom several years to read Jon Krakauer's Into the Wild, but the book was always there, watching me. So now it has permanent squatter's rights in my subconscious, Let me remind you about this book in case you've read other things since the mid-90s. Into the Wild is the dramatization of the life of Christopher McCandless. McCandless grew up in Anywhereville, USA, a typical suburban life in Annandale, Virginia. Mom, dad, one sister at home. He trained for success and glory and ladder climbing from a young age. He graduates college in 1990 from Emory with impressive grades, a bright future ahead of him. But shortly after graduation, McCandless did something that shocked everybody, just ruined their expectations. He cuts off all communication with family and friends, gives away the remainder of his college fund, and begins a solo road trip to Alaska. He would leave the past behind and write his own story. Somewhere in South Dakota, McCandless loses his car in a flash flood. He then decides to hitchhike the rest of the way to the beginning of the Stampede Trail, all the way up there in Alaska. At long last, he makes it to the trailhead and starts off down that snow-covered path to begin a great quest to the Bering Sea. He carried with him 10 pounds of rice, a .22 caliber rifle, some ammo, a camera, a few books. About 4 months later, a group of hunters on this Alaskan trail found McCandless's body. The hunters called the police at once. The cause of death was determined not long thereafter: starvation. Now, if we want to figure out why McCandless went out there all alone in the first place, he did give us some clues. His journals are filled with references to folks like Thoreau, Jack London, Mark Twain, Jules Verne. McCandless loves stories about adventurers who leave civilization behind, adventurers who sever ties with organized society, people who abandon worldly pleasure and the expectations of family, friends, and hometown. But his journals also show that leaving all of this behind creates a crisis of rootlessness in the soul. If all that stuff doesn't define me, then who am I? Well, time to hit the trail and find out. But then it's not good for man to be alone. That's no way for humans to live. Thus, the desire to escape rootlessness by writing your own version of the story. So we just heard the way McCandless attempted this task, this project, as a sort of wilderness wanderer. But let me show you the way most of us mere mortals try to do this thing. Let me call your attention to the quote we printed in the sermon section of your bulletin, if you want to pull that out. We don't normally do this, but we put a quote in there by one of our very best and brightest theologians in the Episcopal Church. One of our best theologians in the Episcopal Church is a fellow named Stanley Hauerwas, Professor Emeritus of Ethics at Duke University. He's definitely worth your time reading. He's even more fun to watch on YouTube. Stanley is a cranky, grumpy old grump of a man. He's got a lot of great things to say, but he carries himself like an incontinent turtle. You just have to see it to believe it. Stanley describes this rootlessness that we're talking about quite like this. You can read along with me with the quote. He says, "The project of modernity was to produce a people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. Such a story is called the story of freedom and is assumed to be irreversibly institutionalized economically, as market capitalism, and politically as democracy. That story and the institutions that embody it is the enemy we must attack through Christian preaching. What a grump. Okay, that quote, though, it needs some explanation, doesn't it? What does he mean? He means we think the most heroic thing a person could do is to reject the expectations of their family, church, government, school, or any institution that claims shaping influential power in their lives. We are all commonly tempted to believe this very thing. Stanley goes on to talk about how this creates nihilism at the shopping mall. In air-conditioned comfort, he says, one can stroll from life to life, from world to world, complete with the appropriate sound effects. Roaring lions over here, beeping computers over here. Laid out before us are all the lives that one can, if one has the necessary credit line, freely choose to inhabit. Devout Christian, high-tech yuppie, down east guide, great white hunter. That's one way to deal with rootlessness, but not a very good one, he says. Let's say you agree. Let's say you too reject consumerism as a way to fashion your identity. Wonderful. But then if you reject an identity pieced together at the mall or on an Amazon app, what are the other options? Leave society and go into the wild? You could try, though even the most solitary Christian monks couldn't escape society. Little societies end up forming around them. We only know about some of these monks because their fans write their biographies, right? You could try going into the wild, though you may end up in a place like McCandless did near the end. One of his last journal entries features a riff on Dr. Zhivago. Happiness is only real when shared. Happiness only real when shared. He wrote that in his dying hours. Friends, you and I, though, are always tempted to believe deep down that only when we take our lives into our own hands, then we're free, then we're brave, then we can speak our truths. Stanley's thesis, though, is that people who really believe this turn out to be bad storytellers themselves. If the only story we have is the story we choose or piece together when we rejected all others, this is a short, lonely one indeed. Once you realize this cultural belief of ours, you're able to see it everywhere. It's hard to unsee it. It was, after all, part of the American experiment to try to be rootless. What was our revolution and resulting constitution, if not a daring, novel experiment? To blaze our own trail, chart our own course, out with the old, in with the new. What is the mission of Christopher McCandless, if not to reject the path his parents, college, and society gave him? If Queen Elizabeth wants to marry Philip of Greece, why should her family make such a fuss? What is the mission of Queen Elsa in Let It Go, if not to let such things go? But if rootlessness can't be solved by leaning into consumerism or into wilderness wandering, what can be done? We have to turn elsewhere for this. Jesus and his church have something to say. It's in an age like ours that Isaiah's root of Jesse prophecy can be seen in a new way, heard afresh, almost for the first time. Turn, if you will, over to our Old Testament reading, the reading from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah the prophet is lamenting the end of the Davidic monarchy and all of the identity-forming power the monarchy offered. King Saul, King David, King Solomon are all dead, and their nation is scattered to the four winds, some to slavery, some to exile. How will the people of God understand their story now? How will they find their roots? Isaiah puts it this way: a shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, a branch shall grow out of his roots. A spotless rose is blowing, sprung from a tender root, of ancient seers' foreshowing of Jesse's promised fruit. In case it wasn't clear, the branch that grows out of Jesse's root is a person. And Isaiah means he's the kind of person you'd want to know. God's Spirit is with him. He's wise and mighty. Strangely, he delights in fearing God. He turns out to be a good king and a good judge. He won't judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he'll judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek. Friends, do you know that that's the hope of the world, the desire of nations? To be judged by standards of truth and not first appearances. To be ruled by someone who judges impartially, favors the oppressed, crushes the oppressors. To be ruled over by someone uninterested in quid pro quo. When this branch from Jesse's root shows up, he extinguishes violence and disharmony in the kingdoms of the world. Wild animals are wild no longer. Wolves play with sheep, and humanity is delivered from all manner of violence, battle, and murder. This branch from Jesse's root grows up into a massive tree that stands as a welcome sign for all peoples, prompting the nations to inquire of him. And on that day, the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. On that day, this root from Jesse will stand as a signal to all peoples, and the nations will ask about him. You might think of the famous Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, now one of the 7 new wonders of the world. Christ on top of the hillside with arms outstretched like a signal to the peoples, prompting nations to inquire. Brothers and sisters, we have an obligation to tell our rootless world that they too can be grafted into Jesse's tree. This is a message about hope. St. Paul looked forward to the day that this branch from Jesse, in whom the Gentiles hope, that is, people who were not a part of God's family originally but have been grafted in, this is what he looks forward to. When you're a branch on a tree, whatever belongs to the roots belongs to you. If the root is holy, he says, so are the branches. This is the language of hope. The ancient people of Israel hoped and believed one day their monarchy would come back. Jesse was King David's father, and out of that family line, out of that tree's root, should spring a new branch, a new king, a new branch who would one day show himself. We believe that too. We celebrated his coronation 2 weeks ago. We'll be celebrating his birth in a few more weeks. Friends, if living under the burden that your story is one that you have to write in order to be free, if that's the kind of burden you're living under, the burden of having to make your own roots, speak your own truths, or something like that, you don't have to do this anymore. Beloved Christian, get in touch with your roots. These roots are found in Jesse's tree. The truth is that since we are in fact God's good creation, we are not free to choose our own stories. Freedom lies not in creating ourselves, but in learning to recognize that everything we have is a gift from God. And where do we learn to recognize our life as the gift we can't create? The church has always said that you learn it right here. You're not your own, we tell you in baptism. You are not your own, we tell you in the Eucharist. And when we put your body in the ground, we don't offer you as a gift back to Grandmother Willow. We commend your soul back to its maker. The church is where we learn that we are indeed contingent beings, and this comes as a great relief. We don't make ourselves, we aren't responsible for our roots. We can't find them at the mall, on Amazon, in astrology, or even out in the wild somewhere. To be contingent is to recognize that our lives make sense only when we know we're characters in a story we didn't write. Not only is that a huge relief, but it makes us humble. There aren't any self-made men in the world. The only self-made men that we've ever known are people who never learned how to say thank you. In a world weary with rootlessness and boredom, God has entrusted us, his church, with the best story in the world and the obligation to tell it to others. The world is searching for a story in which to belong, and we have it to offer. To invite them, root yourselves in Jesse's tree. Belong to a story bigger and better than the ones you've tried to construct or reject. One that will complete your own. Now, at this point, somebody might be wondering about their individuality, their particularity. They might worry that I'm trying to squash it or something like that. Fear not, concerned individualist. We don't mean an abandonment of your originality, but a perfection of it. Destruction is not how God's grace works. God's grace does not destroy our nature and individuality, but perfects it. That's what the incarnation is all about. When God becomes flesh, he doesn't destroy that flesh. The burning bush remains unburned. Behold, a branch is growing of loveliest form and grace. As prophets sung, foreknowing, it springs from Jesse's race. At the end of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia stories, as the chronicles come to a close, the narrator says that for the characters, this was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in the world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of a story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, and which every chapter is better than the one before. Christians, that's what it's like to have roots. That's what it's like to belong. Not to a story you need write, but to one that invites you in. There's no need to abandon your individuality, but there's every need to have it perfected. Jesse's tree always stands as a signal to the peoples of earth. There is nothing to lose by grafting themselves into that tree, and there is everything to gain. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.